Well, if you're Alexander, what are you going to do against something like that?
Alexander viewed each battle as a game of strategy, and he knew this would be a difficult match.
Alexander viewed his army metaphorically as a hammer and an anvil. The phalanx would serve as the anvil. His cavalry, the hammer, would push the enemy. So between the hammer and the anvil, the enemy force would be crushed.
In every previous battle, Alexander's hammer and anvil tactics had worked perfectly. But at Gaugamela, this approach was useless. With a Persian line stretching 4 kilometers, Alexander's cavalry could not possibly outflank the enemy. He would have to come up with an entirely new strategy. First, he grouped his infantry into the phalanx formation. 256 warriors to a square, 16 across and 16 deep, and nearly impossible to stop. This approach to warfare was new in the ancient world. Next, he needed a plan for his other great asset, his cavalry. Well armed and trained to work as a unit, the riders of Macedonia were considered the finest horsemen in the world. Alexander's cavalrymen wore bronze helmets and breastplates. Each was armed with a lance, called an eston.
The lance was approximately 10 feet long. The average cavalry lance was more like 6 feet long, which gave a reach so that you could contact the enemy before he could contact you.
The cavalrymen also carried a curved single-edged sword called a coppice.
A coppice was a great weapon, much more sophisticated than the leaf blade we saw the infantry have. Because of this heavy belly, because of the metal here, and the thinness and lightness here, when you slash, that momentum gives you a lot of power, like a machete or an axe. You can do a lot of damage hacking and cutting, great for hamstringing.
Alexander's challenge was to use the phalanx and cavalry to best advantage. His solution turned traditional strategy on its head. Rather than face the enemy head-on, Alexander arranged for his outnumbered infantry to face the Persian center at an angle.
He comes to the battlefield arrayed in what for the day seemed to be a strange formation. If we were to look at this in modern military terms, if we were to look at the way Alexander arrayed his Macedonian forces, we would say that he approached Darius's line of battle in a left echelon formation with his left flank refused.
The modern military term means that the Macedonian phalanx was arrayed at an angle, with the left side facing outwards away from the battle, prepared for an attack from the side. The echelon, or angled line of attack, confused the enemy, who had never seen this approach to battle before. The Macedonian front line began to march towards the enemy. On the front line of the Persian force were the Immortals, Darius's elite guard.
If one was killed, somebody else stepped up and got in their place. That's why they were known as the Immortals, because there were always 10,000 no matter what you did.
As the Macedonians drew closer, Darius believed Alexander's angled approach had given the Persians an enormous advantage. Darius saw an opportunity in the open ground between the Persian cavalry and Alexander's troops.
Alexander's a smart tactician. He knew that if you offer a cavalry-heavy force open ground, that cavalry will charge across that open ground. It was a given in Alexander's mind that if he offered that open ground, Darius would take advantage of it. And he was right.
Darius ordered his cavalry to charge the Macedonian left. The Macedonian left flank was under the command of Parmenio. He waited for the charge, knowing that his task was to keep the Persian line engaged. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Macedonian line, Alexander did something completely unexpected. He turned his cavalry to the right.
In an unexpected move, particularly unexpected to King Darius, Alexander begins to ride parallel to the line of battle. A curious move in the eyes of Darius, who's concerned that Alexander might ride off of the prepared battlefield at Gaugamela. Or, more likely, Alexander might outflank him, might be able to turn to the left and ride down his flank, thus carving him up in detail. So Darius can't tolerate this. He sends signals to his cousin Bessus, commander of the Bactrian cavalry, the heavy cavalry, on the Persian left. He says, "Stop that." Bessus makes his move with his cavalry. They begin to ride parallel with Alexander.
The unorthodox tactic was unsettling to Darius, but he had little time to be concerned. For in the center of the battlefield, the unbreakable phalanx of Alexander's army was about to clash with the elite guard of the Persian force. As the center and right clashed, Alexander and his companion cavalry continued to ride to the right, whilst the Persian cavalry matched their progress. But Alexander had a hidden advantage. Running on foot between the horses of the cavalry was a complete regiment of peltasts, or light infantry.
Peltasts were the skirmishers who were seen all around the battlefield, in and out, with lots of a variety of weapons. And when they hit you with stuff, they pelt you. So we still use that word today, from the peltasts, lobbing you with sticks and stones.
Now, they used several weapons, these peltasts. They used short bows, short-range arrows. They used javelins. They'd have a weapon much like this, a light, very aerodynamic spear, not designed so much for range, but designed for velocity. From that, we get this sort of thing. Charles, thank you. This is the modern scholastic competition, Olympic-style competition, javelins. Thing to remember is, from that came this. How effective are they? Let's see. So javelins were used by peltasts, by skirmishers, out in front of the battle line to pick off high-value targets, those officers, those chariot crews, and to keep the enemy on edge, unbalanced. One of the other weapons that they used was really quite common to the era. It was called the sling. They might look something like this, a very simple piece of gear. A leather pouch sewn so as to give it a pocket to contain the missile or the rock, and two plated or braided lengths which would serve to launch the missile. Now, that stone may not look like it have injured anyone downrange, but imagine this, 200 or 300 peltasts, all armed with these slings, all throwing metal objects or rocks into the enemy line of battle. Somebody's going to get hurt, or more importantly, somebody's going to get rattled.
With the peltasts hidden from the Persians, Alexander moved steadily across the battlefield. The peltasts were an essential part of Alexander's strategy to win the battle. As Alexander rode away, the front line of the Persian army began to feel the full power of the Macedonian phalanx. Seeing his elite troops push back, Darius decided to deploy his most feared weapon, the scythe chariot.
A scythe chariot was basically a two-wheeled chariot with scythes, so blades attached to the wheels so they stuck out horizontally so they would cut down people who they hit.
200 scythe chariots, the supreme weapon of the Persian army, burst forth from Darius's front line. Previous opposing commanders had seen only two defenses against this onslaught. Either stand their ground or retreat before the giant blades and regroup later. But Alexander had devised a third tactic to defeat them.
Darius launches his chariots.